You know, when you hear the name Texas Instruments, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably that calculator from high school math, right? But the real story of how this tech giant got started is one of dynamite, oil wildcatters, and an absolutely massive bet-the-farm gamble made on the eve of a global catastrophe. Okay, let's dive into this incredible origin story.
So, let's set the scene. The date is December 6, 1941. It's a Saturday, and down in Dallas, Texas, a group of men are about to finalize a deal that is going to change their lives forever.
Now, these weren't just any engineers. They were the absolute heart and soul of a company called Geophysical Service Incorporated, or GSI. And they pulled everything they had, personal savings, collateral, you name it, to buy the very company they had helped build. This was it. This was their moment of triumph.
But then, less than 24 hours later, the world changed. The attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States into World War II, and their entire market just vanished overnight. So how on earth did a company built to find oil manage to survive something like that? Well, to understand the answer, we have to go back to the very beginning.
First things first, you have to understand that this was a company literally born from the earth. To really get how Texas Instruments would later invent the silicon transistor and the integrated circuit, you have to know that it wasn't born in some clean, sterile lab. Nope, it was forged in the rugged, dirty oil fields of the American Southwest. And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? TI's DNA was absolutely nothing like the tech companies that would pop up decades later. It was shaped by the practical, demanding, and often messy work of oil exploration. This wasn't a story of garages and microchips, not yet anyway. It was a story of geology and pure grit. Just look at this comparison, it really puts it all in perspective. The typical tech startup goal is all about miniaturization. For these guys, their goal was finding black gold. Their expertise wasn't semiconductors, it was geophysics. And their culture? Well, it wasn't born in a nice suburban garage. It was forged out in the oil patch, where you had to be self-reliant and solve problems on the fly just to survive. That practical, get-it-done mindset would prove to be absolutely crucial later on. So how'd they do it? How did they find all that oil? Well, it all came down to what they called the science of echoes. The entire company was built on a single, revolutionary piece of technology that let them see deep underground where nobody else could. That technology was called reflection seismology. And the concept is, honestly, genius in its simplicity. You create a small, controlled explosion on the surface, and then you just listen. You listen for the echoes of that sound wave as it bounces off different layers of rock, deep, deep underground.
Here's how it worked, broken down into 4 basic steps. First, you set off a stick of dynamite. Second, you use these incredibly sensitive microphones, called geophones, to record the echoes as they come back up. Third, you use all that data to build a super detailed 3-dimensional map of what's going on miles beneath your feet. And finally, you use that map to find the exact geological spots where oil loves to hide. It's like a treasure map.
And you've got to understand, this was a quantum leap, a total game changer. The old methods were basically just educated guesswork. GSI's reflection method, though, that was different. It measured waves bouncing off the rock, which created a precise 3D map. It single-handedly turned wildcatting from an art into a science.
But you know, technology is nothing without the people behind it. And this story is really about the forefathers of the company who took an unbelievable risk. So let's meet the men who not only mastered this science, but also had the guts to bet their entire futures on it.
This was the leadership team, the dream team, really. You had McDermott, the scientific visionary. Johnson was the operational genius who made the whole machine run like clockwork. Cecil Green was the master of the field crews, keeping all the clients happy. And Bates Peacock was their top geophysicist. Just think of them as the perfect blend of science, operations, and sales. They were an unstoppable team. But by the early 1940s, they had a huge problem. See, their parent company, Coronado Corporation, had started drilling for its own oil. This meant GSI was now directly competing with its own clients. And you can guess what happened, right? Suddenly, nobody wanted to hire them. Their business was just drying up.
And everything just happened so incredibly fast. By 1941, their parent company sold off its oil assets, basically stranding GSI with no support. It was now or never for these 4 guys. So on December 6th, they do it. They signed the papers, pooling all their money to buy the company. They were finally in control. And then came December 7th.
Which brings us full circle, right back to where we started. The day after everything changed. This is the moment where that feeling of pure triumph turns to absolute terror in the span of a single sunrise.
Just try to imagine how they felt on December 6th. McDermott, Johnson, Green, and Peacock, they must have been on top of the world. They'd achieved their dream.
The company was finally theirs. They were independent, free from all those corporate conflicts, and totally ready to dominate the market that they had helped create. But then came Sunday morning, December 7th, a day that, as President Roosevelt would say, would live in infamy. The news of the attack on Pearl Harbor just swept across the nation. And for the brand new owners of GSI, this wasn't just a national tragedy, it was an immediate and existential threat to their company.
And here's exactly why it was so catastrophic. The global oil exploration market didn't just shrink, it completely evaporated. I mean, literally overnight. Borders slammed shut, resources were immediately redirected for the war, and their entire customer base vanished. After just one day of ownership, they were on the brink of immediate bankruptcy.
So what on earth does hunting for oil have to do with hunting for enemy submarines? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But believe it or not, the answer to that question is the key to how this small, seismic company totally reinvented itself, and in the process, helped kickstart the digital revolution. All right, so our story really begins with a company called Geophysical Service Inc., or GSI for short. Now, their whole business was about one thing: finding oil. But then World War II hits, and suddenly they're facing a huge problem. The war effort is sucking up all the resources, their main business is basically grinding to a halt. They were in big trouble. They needed a lifeline, and fast. And this is where someone at GSI had this incredible aha moment. They realized that the basic physics of what they did every day, sending out a signal, waiting for it to bounce back, and then reading that data to find oil, well, that was the exact same process the military needed to find enemy submarines. The core skill was identical. They just had to change the target. So, seeing this huge opportunity, GSI went all in. They started chasing government defense contracts like their life depended on it. And it kind of did. They were about to make this massive pivot, jumping from the rough and tumble world of geology into the super precise field of military electronics. And let me tell you, this move was going to change everything for them. Their big break came from the US Navy. You see, the Navy was having a terrible time in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were wreaking havoc. They desperately needed a way to spot these submarines from the air. This is where GSI's engineers came in. They took what they knew and built these things called magnetic anomaly detectors, or MADs for short. The idea was brilliant. You stick one of these on a plane, fly it over the ocean, and it can actually detect the huge metal hull of a submarine lurking under the surface. You have to understand, this contract was a total game changer. GSI had to learn a whole new way of doing things, and they had to do it fast. They went from making this rugged, tough-as-nails seismic gear to manufacturing incredibly precise, military-grade electronics. And with that came all the headaches of military-grade quality control and the mountains of paperwork you get with the Department of Defense. They were literally becoming a different company right before their own eyes. But here's the thing. The most important thing GSI got out of the war, it wasn't a new piece of tech. It wasn't even that big government contract. No, it was a person. And that person was a lieutenant named Patrick E. Haggerty. He was the Navy liaison, the guy sent to basically keep an eye on GSI's work. But the leaders at GSI were just blown away by him. He was incredibly smart, he understood manufacturing inside and out, and he was just bursting with ambition. They took one look at the sky and knew, we have to get him on our team. So as the war was winding down, they made their move. They offered him a job. Haggerty said yes, but he had one condition, and it was a big one. It was non-negotiable. He told them, I don't just want a job. I want to lead a revolution. He insisted that GSI had to fully commit, no turning back, to becoming a major electronics manufacturer. See, Haggerty saw the future in a way that maybe they didn't yet. He knew that the skills GSI had picked up building all this military gear had massive potential, way beyond just defense contracts. So his demand wasn't just, a negotiation tactic. It was a new destiny, a roadmap for the entire future of the company. So after the war, the company was kind of living this strange double life. You had the original GSI, still out there, hunting for oil all over the world. And then you had Haggerty's new division, the laboratory and manufacturing arm, which was all about electronics and defense contracts. It was like a company with two heads pulling in two different directions. And man, Haggerty's side of the business just took off like a rocket ship. I mean, think about this. By 1950, only 5 years after he joined, his little electronics division was growing way faster than the original oil business that created it in the first place. It was the classic case of the tail wagging the dog. This small, new electronics division, the tail, was now totally in charge, pulling the whole company, the dog, along with it. A massive power shift was happening inside the company, and you can bet everyone knew it. Okay, so with this new reality, they had a problem. The name Geophysical Service Inc. just didn't fit anymore. It didn't reflect who they were becoming. It was time for a big change, the total reorganization. The whole process was pretty straightforward. Step 1, they all agreed their future was in electronics. Step 2, they came up with a new name, General Instruments. Sounds good, right? Well, there was a problem. It was already taken, so back to the drawing board. In 1951, they landed on a new name, Texas Instruments Incorporated. And as part of this whole shuffle, the original company, GSI, was officially made a subsidiary of this new parent company. Have you ever heard of a bet that literally changed the world? Well, this is that story. It's about a single, gutsy $25,000 gamble by a company nobody was really paying attention to. And let me tell you, this bet didn't just pay off. It's the reason we have the world of consumer electronics we know today. So to really get why this was such a huge deal, you've got to picture the world back in 1952. On one side, you had what they called portable electronics. We're talking about these heavy, fragile boxes stuffed with vacuum tubes. They took forever to warm up and just ate batteries for breakfast. But on the other side, well, that was the dream, right? The science fiction fantasy of a radio that could actually fit in your pocket. Yeah, calling them portable was, let's just say, a bit of an exaggeration. Sure, you could lug one around, but slipping it into your pocket? No way. This was the era ruled by the tyranny of the vacuum tube. But then, this one moment comes along that changes everything. AT&T's legendary Bell Labs. They decide to license out the patent for this brand new invention, the transistor. They set a price, and all the big dogs in electronics, your RCAs, your General Electrics, they all had to look at this thing and decide, is this little gadget worth the gamble? And the price tag? $25,000. Now that might not sound like a ton today, but back in 1952, that was serious cash, especially if you weren't one of those massive global corporations. And for a company like Texas Instruments, which was, a mid-sized defense contractor at the time, this was not pocket change. This was a huge bet-the-farm kind of risk on a technology that, frankly, most of the industry just saw as a weird little sideshow. So what did the big players do? They kind of shrugged. They thought the transistor was, interesting, but way too immature for the big leagues. They figured, hey, maybe it's good for some niche stuff like hearing aids, but they just could not imagine it replacing the good old vacuum tube. So they passed. It's a textbook case, isn't it? The big guys on top completely whiffing on the next big thing. But there was this one guy at Texas Instruments, Patrick Haggerty, and he saw something totally different. He wasn't looking at a tiny component for a hearing aid. No, he was looking at the future. And somehow, he got his board to see it too, to take that massive leap of faith and cut that $25,000 check. Okay, so they've got the license. Great. But Haggerty was smart. He knew that a piece of paper wasn't enough. If they were going to pull this off, they needed some serious scientific firepower. So he went out and poached this brilliant scientist from Bell Labs named Gordon Teal. And Gordon Teal, well, he had a one-track mind, and it was focused on one specific element. This is where we get to a real fork in the road for the entire industry. See, everyone, and I mean everyone, was betting on a material called germanium. It was easier to work with, cheaper to get pure, but it had this one massive, fatal flaw. It hated heat. Gordon Teal, though, he was the lone voice in the wilderness, betting everything on silicon. It was way harder, way more expensive, but it was tough as nails and electrically just plain better. And look, this wasn't some nerdy academic debate. For Texas Instruments' bread and butter, their military contracts, this was a complete deal breaker. Think about it. You can't stick a germanium transistor in the guidance system of a jet or a missile. The heat would cause this thing called thermal runaway, where the component basically cooks itself to death. For anything that mattered, germanium was a total dead end. So while the rest of the world is pulling their hair out over flimsy germanium, Gordon Teal and his team at TI are quietly, secretly, cracking the code on silicon. And all that hard work is about to lead to one of the most epic mic drop moments in the history of technology, all going down at an engineering conference in Dayton, Ohio.
Picture this. It's 1954 at this huge electronics conference. All morning, you've got the smartest engineers in the world giving these talks, one after another, all about how much germanium stinks and how many problems it has. The vibe in the room is unanimous. A working, commercial silicon transistor? Yeah, right. Maybe in a few years. It's pure science fiction. And then, in the afternoon, this unannounced speaker, Gordon Teal from Texas Instruments, just strolls up to the podium.
So he gives his talk, and then he just detonates a bomb in the middle of the conference. He looks out at the sea of skeptical faces and says something like, "Contrary to what my colleagues have told you, I happen to have a few of them right here in my pocket." Can you just imagine the silence, the jaws hitting the floor? And he didn't just pull them out of his pocket. No. He brings out a working record player running on his new silicone transistors. And then for the grand finale, he takes the amplifier circuit and dunks it into a beaker of hot oil. And the music, it doesn't even stutter. It just keeps playing crystal clear. The place went nuts, absolutely erupted. In that one single moment, this mid-sized company from Texas had just lapped the entire planet's electronics industry. They weren't just ahead of the competition wasn't even in the same race anymore. So what does a demo like that get you? How about a nearly 3-year monopoly on what was now the most critical piece of military tech in the world? While every other company was scrambling, trying to reverse engineer what TI had done, TI was already cashing checks. And they were selling these things for as much as $150 a piece. That's like over $1,000 in today's money for one single transistor. That $25,000 bet, it was paying off big time. And all that money was being plowed right back into more R&D. But remember Patrick Hagerty, the visionary? For him, this was never just about fat military contracts. He knew that to really change the world, these transistors had to escape the missile silos and get into the hands of regular people. He had his sights set on the consumer market, which, of course, presented a huge business challenge. Selling to the military is great, high prices, big profits, but it's low volume. If you want to make these things cheap enough for everybody, you need to make millions of them. You need scale. So what's the killer app? What's the one product that could create that kind of insane demand? Hagerty knew the answer: the pocket radio. So TI takes this brilliant idea to the big boys, the RCAs of the world. And what happens? Deja vu. The giants say, no thanks. They're still convinced transistors are too expensive for a regular consumer product. So just like before, TI has to team up with another underdog, this small company out of Indianapolis that made antennas called IDEA. And together, on October 18, 1954, they launched the Regency TR-1. This was it, the world's very first transistor radio. It was a clever piece of engineering using just 4 transistors to keep the cost down to $49.95. It came in these cool colors like mandarin red, and boom, it sold 150,000 units in the first year alone. It wasn't just a gadget, it became an instant status symbol. The success of the TR-1 sent a massive shockwave through the entire industry. It was the ultimate proof that a huge mass market for transistors was real, and it lit a fire under competitors all over the globe, including this one small startup in Japan, a little company called Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo. You probably know them by their later name, Sony. Here's the kicker though. The TR-1 radio itself didn't make TI fabulously wealthy. That wasn't the point. Its real value was strategic. It was the spark that ignited the massive global fire for semiconductors that Patrick Hagerty had bet on all those years ago. It was, quite literally, the big bang for the entire consumer electronics industry. All right, we're in the late 1950s. Ambition is running high, you know? Computers are getting more and more powerful, and military gear is getting super complex. But all of that incredible progress was about to smack right into a massive physical wall. And that wall had a name: the tyranny of numbers. The logic was just brutal and inescapable. You see, more complexity meant more individual parts. Transistors, resistors, capacitors, the whole shebang. And every single one of those little components had to be made separately and then painstakingly wired together by hand. The scale of this problem was just immense. An advanced system could easily have 100,000 soldered joints. Now think about that for a second. That's not just 100,000 connections, that's 100,000 individual places where something could go wrong. The odds of the whole thing actually working perfectly were just plummeting with every new piece they added. So this wasn't just one problem, it was a whole cascade of them. The systems were incredibly heavy, they were astronomically expensive to build, and maybe worst of all, they were just frustratingly unreliable. And because everything had to be soldered by hand, making them any smaller was physically impossible. Progress had literally ground to a halt. Now, the industry did try to find a workaround. They came up with these things called micro-modules. You can think of them like sophisticated little Lego bricks, basically prepackaged blocks of components. But honestly, it was just a cosmetic fix. It was like tidying up the mess, but it did absolutely nothing to solve the real problem: thousands and thousands of separate, failure-prone connections. But right into this complete mess steps a brand new engineer at a company called Texas Instruments. He was in the perfect place at the perfect time with exactly the right kind of brain to see this problem in a completely new way. So this guy, Jack Kilby, had just been hired at Texas Instruments in July of 1958. And as the new guy, he didn't have any vacation time saved up. So when the entire company shut down for its big mass vacation in August, he was left completely alone in the lab. And it was in that quiet, that solitude, totally free from distractions, that he had the big idea. By September, he had a working prototype. Incredible, right? This was his revolutionary insight. You see, everyone else was totally focused on how to connect all the little pieces better. Kilby asked a completely different question. What if there were no pieces? What if you could build all the components, the transistors, the resistors, the capacitors, out of a single, solid block of the exact same material? It was an idea so elegant, so radical, it would come to be known as the monolithic idea. And the first prototype? It was unbelievably crude. It was this tiny sliver of germanium glued to a glass slide with these messy wires just sticking out, held down by wax. It looked like a high school science project, seriously. But when Kilby applied a little voltage, a perfect, steady sine wave appeared on the oscilloscope. It worked. And in that one moment, the tyranny of numbers was officially broken. But Kilby wasn't the only one wrestling with this problem. Halfway across the country, another brilliant mind was closing in on his own solution, and he was about to become Kilby's greatest rival. And that rival was Robert Noyce, over at Fairchild Semiconductor. Their two approaches really highlight the difference between inventing something and actually making it practical. Kilby, he was the pioneer. He proved it could be done with his germanium chip and its messy flying wires. But Noyce was the pragmatist. He used silicon and figured out a way to basically print the connections right onto the chip. So while Kilby's was first, Noyce's was the one that was actually designed for mass production. So with billions of dollars on the line, you know what happened next, right? Lawyers. A massive decade-long legal war blew up over who really invented the integrated circuit. After years and years of fighting, the companies basically just called it a draw and agreed to cross-license the patents. And today, history rightly remembers both Kilby and Noyce as the co-inventors who kicked off the digital age. So the invention was real. It existed. But now it faced a brand new and pretty formidable barrier: cost. Early integrated circuits were just incredibly expensive. For this revolution to actually begin, the industry needed a catalyst, a customer with a problem so urgent and pockets so deep that they would pay pretty much any price. And the price was staggering. We're talking about the early 1960s here, and a single integrated circuit could cost over $100. At that price, it was a fascinating little toy for a lab, but it sure wasn't going to change the world. That customer turned out to be the US government. For the military and the space race, the tyranny of numbers wasn't just some inconvenience. It was a mission-critical, life-or-death weak point. The Air Force needed a guidance computer for its Minuteman II missile that was light, small, and above all, absolutely reliable. And NASA needed the exact same thing for the Apollo lunar modules. The integrated circuit was the only solution, and the government was willing to pay whatever it took. And this was the crucial turning point. Those huge government contracts created demand on a scale nobody had ever seen before. Texas Instruments had to figure out mass production, and fast. And the result? A spectacular price collapse. In just a few years, the cost of a single chip went from over $100 all the way down to less than $10. That massive price drop was the key that unlocked the modern world. All of a sudden, the integrated circuit wasn't just for missiles and moonlanders anymore. It was actually affordable enough for commercial products, and the electronics revolution could finally, truly begin. So, what was the ultimate legacy of this one monolithic idea? As we're about to see, it wasn't just some small improvement. It was a complete and total paradigm shift. Look at this. The integrated circuit didn't just solve one part of the tyranny of numbers, it solved all of them. It completely reversed every single one of the old limitations. Reliability? It shot through the roof. Size and weight? They practically vanished. Cost? It became trivial. And all that painstaking manual labor was replaced by mass manufacturing. It was a total, complete victory over the old way of doing things. And that victory was immensely valuable. I mean, decades later, in the 1980s, the patent portfolio for the integrated circuit was actually called one of Texas Instruments' most lethal strategic weapons in the corporate world. It was generating billions, with a B, in royalties and cemented its legacy forever. You know that Texas Instruments calculator you probably had in school? Ever wonder how they became, well, the name in calculators? Their journey to the top wasn't just about clever engineering. Oh no. It was a brutal, brilliant war that absolutely wiped out their competition and, believe it or not, actually laid the groundwork for the phone that's in your pocket right now. So let's get into it. So where did this all begin? It kicked off with a simple but huge challenge. It's 1967, and a TI leader, Patrick Haggerty, tells his team to create a handheld electronic calculator. They weren't just trying to make a new gadget. They were trying to make the slide rule, the tool every engineer used, completely obsolete. And that challenge? It lit a fire under what they called the Caltech project. The result was this prototype that could add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and it fit right in the palm of your hand. This one invention started a chain reaction that would completely change the world of consumer electronics. And here's where things get really wild. Look at this price crash. A calculator that cost $150 in 1972 was selling for just $20 4 years later. Now the big question is, how in the world do you pull that off without going completely bankrupt? The answer is, well, it's a masterclass in corporate warfare. You see, TI wasn't just playing to participate in the market. They were playing to own it. And to do that, they came up with a plan that was, frankly, ruthless. And it started by turning on their very own customers. So up until this point, TI was mostly a supplier. They were selling the guts of calculators, the chips, to other companies. But then, in '72, bam, they dropped their own calculator, the DataMath 2500. Think about that for a second. They were now competing head-to-head with the same companies that were buying their parts. That is an incredibly aggressive move. And this right here, this was their secret weapon, vertical integration. So while their competitors were scrambling to buy parts from all these different suppliers, and hey, a lot of the time they were buying them from TI, Texas Instruments, was doing it all themselves. The chips, the keyboards, the displays, the whole shebang. When you control the entire manufacturing process, you control the cost. And that gave them an advantage that nobody else could touch. And for the competition, the result was, well, it was brutal. We're talking about companies like Bomar, who were actual pioneers in this space, and they just couldn't keep up. Imagine buying chips from your biggest competitor while they are relentlessly slashing the price of their finished product. It was a death sentence. They were driven straight into bankruptcy. The bottom line is, TI didn't just win, they won big. But this kind of victory always comes with a price, and it wasn't just paid by competitors, it was paid by the people working inside TI. The guy behind this aggressive push was CEO Mark Shepard, and he built this demanding, super high-pressure internal culture that, well, it had a really dark side. Shepard brought in this management system called OST. And, on paper, the idea makes sense, right? Get this huge, sprawling company all rowing in the same direction. And for a little while, it worked. But pretty soon, this tool for alignment started to turn into a bureaucratic nightmare. In practice, the OST system became this monster. I'm not kidding. Managers would spend months just preparing these enormous strategy documents. The focus shifted from actually doing things to just endlessly planning them. The system that was meant to make them agile ended up freezing everything in place. And if the bureaucracy wasn't enough, there was this brutal policy for employees. The philosophy was simple: up or out. If you weren't getting promoted, if you weren't constantly climbing that ladder, you were on your way out the door. Failure, or even just moving too slow, was not an option. What all of this created was something you could only call a Darwinian culture. Engineers were literally pitted against each other. And yeah, it drove incredible short-term performance, no doubt, but it came at the cost of long-term morale. It was a total pressure cooker, and it burned a lot of great people out. And yet, and this is what's so wild about this whole story, out of this flawed, high-stress system, something truly revolutionary was born. And a final surprising twist, a simple children's toy would end up holding the key to the next 50 years of technology. So, in 1978, in the midst of all this internal chaos, TI released the Speak and Spell. I mean, on the surface, it was just an educational toy, right? A cool little gadget that could synthesize a human voice to help kids learn how to spell. It seemed totally random and unrelated to their main business. But it wasn't just a toy. Hidden inside that plastic shell was a technology so advanced it would become the absolute cornerstone of the mobile phone era, which was still decades away. The Speak and Spell was powered by the first ever chip of its kind, one that could process real-world signals like sound in real time. This was the birth of the Digital Signal Processor, or DSP. This technology is exactly what allows your phone to understand your voice, process images, and connect to a cell tower. So really, this children's toy was a Trojan horse. It smuggled a world-changing technology into the market, disguised as an educational product. And that DSP technology that TI secretly incubated inside the Speak and Spell, that's the reason they went on to dominate the mobile phone chip market for decades. All right, picture this, a tech giant at the absolute peak of its power, so confident after crushing all its competition that it decides to just go and conquer a brand new market. But this isn't some made-up story. This is the real, true story of Texas Instruments and the home computer. And it's a wild cautionary tale of how a company with a way better product lost a war it absolutely should have won. So that's really the big question we're digging into here, right? How does a titan like that actually fall? And believe me, this isn't just a nostalgic look at some old tech. It's a masterclass in strategy, in hubris, and in all-out corporate warfare, with lessons that are still ringing true in boardrooms today. To really get why the fall was so spectacular, you first have to understand just how high they were. We're talking the late 70s, and Texas Instruments, well, they were an absolute powerhouse. They were fresh off a massive victory in the calculator wars, and they decided to set their sights on the next big thing, the home computer. And man, their entry was impressive. In 1979, they launched the TI-99/4. Yeah, okay, it had a famously bad keyboard, but they fixed that really fast. By 1981, the new and improved TI-99/4A hit the market, and sales they started to take off. By early 1982, you just couldn't deny it. Their success was huge. They had grabbed over a third of the entire home computer market. For a company that had just stepped into the ring, commanding 35% of the market was just staggering. They weren't just playing the game, they looked like they were on track to win the whole thing. And here's the kicker, the thing that should have sealed the deal for them, the technology. The TI-99/4A was a beast. It was running on a 16-bit processor, while its rivals, Apple and Commodore, were still stuck on older 8-bit tech. It was literally like bringing a sports car to a go-kart race. On paper, there was just no way they could lose. But, as we all know, having the best product, well, it's not always enough, is it? Because hiding right underneath all that incredible success, a single, critical, strategic mistake was starting to rot the whole foundation of TI's empire. This right here was their fatal flaw. So what was this flaw? A closed ecosystem. TI wanted to control everything. If you bought their computer, you had to buy their peripherals, their software, their upgrades, the whole shebang. It was a walled garden designed to lock customers in and let TI profit on every single piece. It's a strategy that, well, it might sound a little familiar if you look at some tech companies today. And this strategy, it had immediate disastrous results. It completely alienated all the third-party developers were out there making a universe of amazing software for the competition. Customers felt trapped, forced to buy TI's super expensive add-ons. It just choked all the life and innovation that was making platforms like Apple's so exciting. Now, a massive vulnerability like this, it doesn't go unnoticed. In fact, it basically painted a giant bullseye on TI's back for one particular rival who had a very personal score to settle. And that brings us to Jack Tramiel, the CEO of Commodore. See, Tramiel had some serious history with TI. During the calculator wars, TI's aggressive tactics had almost driven his company into the ground. He did not forget that. And now, he was looking for a little revenge.
This quote from Tramiel really says it all. For him, this wasn't just about market share. It was personal. He was about to turn the entire home computer market into a battlefield. Tramiel knew TI's weakness wasn't its technology, it was its business model. And he attacked that weakness with the most brutal weapon in the corporate arsenal, a full-blown price war.
And the collapse was just breathtakingly fast. In mid-1982, a TI-99/4A sold for a pretty respectable $400. But every single time TI dropped its price, Commodore just relentlessly undercut them. First with the VIC-20, then with the legendary Commodore 64. In just 1 year, the price plummeted to under $100, which meant TI was now losing money on every single unit that left the factory. So you have to wonder, why couldn't a giant like TI just fight back? Because, ironically, its greatest strength, that complex, expensive manufacturing, had become its greatest weakness. The TI-99/4A was a sophisticated machine, and it cost a lot to make. Commodore, meanwhile, their computers were simple, they were cheap to build, and they owned their own chip supplier, which gave them a massive cost advantage. Commodore could afford to bleed a little in a price war. TI was hemorrhaging cash. You don't need an MBA to know that a company can't lose money on every sale forever. This price war was totally unsustainable, and the end for Texas Instruments' home computer division was coming, and it was going to be swift and brutal. And this is where that closed ecosystem strategy came back to haunt them one last time. The whole plan, remember, was to lose money on the console, but make it all back selling those expensive software cartridges. Except it didn't work. Those profits never showed up, and they definitely didn't show up fast enough to cover the catastrophic losses on the hardware.
And then the final bill came due. In 1983, Texas Instruments announced a staggering loss of $330 million, and that was just from its home computer division. In today's money, we're talking nearly $1 billion, an absolutely devastating amount of money.
And that was it. In October 1983, just a few years after their triumphant entry, TI threw in the towel. They completely abandoned the home computer market, and that aura of invincibility the company had, it was shattered. Now, TI was an absolute powerhouse, but it was run with a very specific and honestly a very demanding internal philosophy. So what was this rule? It was known as up or out, and it meant exactly what it sounds like. You had to be constantly climbing the corporate ladder. Now, here's the crucial part. This wasn't about getting rid of bad employees. No. Even if you were a super competent, really valuable engineer, if you just hit a plateau in your career, if you stopped advancing, you were often sidelined or just plain pushed out the door. You can probably imagine what a policy like that does to the atmosphere inside a company. It had this immediate and pretty chilling effect on the two things that are the lifeblood of any tech company: innovation and collaboration. And you can just see the toxic side effects here. Yeah, it created fierce internal competition, which might sound good, but in reality, it just made everyone incredibly scared to take risks. I mean, why would you bet your career on some bold, unproven idea when your job literally depended on constantly getting promoted? It was just so much safer to stick with the tried and true. So what you ended up with was a system that was basically designed to reward safe projects. You know, the ones that could be easily measured and fit neatly into the existing business models. And in doing that, it completely starved the visionary, often risky ideas that could have become the next huge thing. It's like the classic innovator's dilemma, but it was baked right into their HR policy. But look, policies aren't just abstract ideas on a piece of paper. Their consequences are very, very human. This up or out culture didn't just kill ideas, it pushed out the very people who were dreaming them up. And the most consequential casualty of them all was this man, Morris Chang. And listen, this was not some mid-level manager we're talking about. Chang was an absolute titan within the company. He was running the entire semiconductor division and was widely seen as a guy who could one day be CEO of the whole company. So how on earth did a company like TI lose a talent like this? Well, in the early 80s, Chang started butting heads with the top brass. He was convinced the future was all about semiconductor innovation, but they were obsessed with consumer gadgets like calculators and watches. And because he wasn't on board with their big plan, he got reassigned to a staff role, which, is the classic corporate way of putting someone on the shelf. By the end of 1983, he'd had enough, and he was gone. And this, right here, this is why. This quote really gets to the heart of it. Chang himself said he felt like he was being put out to pasture. He had hit that exact career plateau that the company's up-or-out culture just hated. His vision was shot down, his upward climb had stalled, and so, according to TI's unwritten rules, his time was up. Okay, so this is the moment where the story just completely pivots. It goes from being an internal corporate drama to a massive global event, because Texas Instruments' incredible loss was about to become Taiwan's single greatest gain. So, after leaving TI, Morris Chang gets recruited by the Taiwanese government. They had this incredibly bold ambition to build their own world-class electronics industry. And by 1987, Chang had founded a brand new company for them, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or as we all know it, TSMC. And with TSMC, he pioneered a totally revolutionary new business concept. He called it the foundry model. And the idea was, well, it was visionary. And at the time, super risky. TSMC wasn't going to design its own chips. Nope. Instead, it was going to be a pure play manufacturer. It would make chips for any company that came to them with a design. It was exactly the kind of bold, paradigm-shifting idea that the culture back at Texas Instruments was basically engineered to kill. And the success of that model? Wow. It didn't just launch a successful company. It fundamentally rewired the entire global technology industry. It really did create a new world order in how things get made. So what was the result? Well, TSMC became, you could easily argue, the single most important semiconductor company on the planet. Its existence allowed for this Cambrian explosion of fabless chip companies. We're talking giants like NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Apple, companies that could now focus purely on design because they knew TSMC could handle the incredibly complex manufacturing. And all of this was built by the guy that TI's culture just pushed right out the door. All right, today we're gonna unpack the absolutely gripping comeback story of Texas Instruments. We're talking about a tech giant that helped build the modern world as we know it, only to find itself teetering on the absolute brink of collapse. Until, that is, it fought its way back with a very surprising and incredibly powerful weapon. It's a question that probably keeps a lot of CEOs up at night. For Texas Instruments, or TI as you probably know them, the answer came hard and fast in the mid-1980s. The fall wasn't gradual, it was swift, it was brutal, and it all kicked off with one single, frankly, terrifying number. And this is it. This is the number that just sent shockwaves through the entire company. You have to understand, in 1985, for the first time in its entire history, TI posted a massive annual loss. The company wasn't just, having a bad quarter, it was literally bleeding cash at an absolutely alarming rate. So to really get how this happened, we've got to step onto the battlefield. And I mean that literally. The global semiconductor market of the 1980s, well, it wasn't so much a market as it was an all-out war zone. See, this wasn't just healthy competition. It was a coordinated, full-on campaign. You had these massive Japanese conglomerates. We're talking Hitachi, NEC, Toshiba, and they were just flooding the entire world with memory chips, often with a lot of help from their government. And the strategy they were using? Well, it has a name. It's called dumping. The goal is brutally simple. You sell your stuff for so cheap, often even below what it costs to make, that you just drive all your competitors out of business. And let me tell you, for American companies at the time, it was working. Now, faced with this kind of pricing pressure, even a giant like Intel, that Intel, made a strategic retreat. They got out of the memory chip business completely. But Texas Instruments, they dug in their heels. I mean, this was one of the companies that built the industry from the ground up. They just refused to be pushed out of a market they had helped create. But look, TI knew it couldn't win this fight just on the factory floor. The economics were impossible. So their first move was to open up a whole new front in Washington, D.C. This is where things get really interesting. TI basically spearheaded a massive lobbying effort, and their argument was incredibly smart, especially for the time. They said, look, this isn't just a business problem. This is a national security problem. The pitch was brilliant and simple.
How can you have a modern military if you can't securely build your own modern electronics right here at home? And you know what? It actually worked. This pressure campaign led directly to the 1986 US-Japan Semiconductor Trade Agreement. And this was a huge deal. The pact basically forced Japanese companies to stop the dumping and to open up their own markets to competition. It leveled the playing field. Now, this political victory gave TI something they desperately needed: breathing room. It didn't solve all their problems overnight, not by a long shot, but it stopped the financial bleeding. The prices stabilized, and that gave the company a critical window of time to figure out its next move. And that next move? Well, it was something no one saw coming. While all this political fighting was going on, someone deep inside TI, probably in the legal department, had a major aha moment. They realized they were going to turn the company's own history into a weapon. It was a moment of pure strategic genius. They looked inward at their own assets and realized they were sitting on an absolute gold mine: their patent portfolio. We're talking foundational patents, including the one from Jack Kilby for the original integrated circuit, the microchip itself. Think about that. It meant that pretty much every modern electronic device being cranked out by their competitors was technically using TI's invention. So TI went on the offensive. They launched this incredibly aggressive legal campaign. And their message to all these other companies was simple, powerful, and not open for negotiation. Pay us a royalty for using our invention, or you will be banned from selling your products in the US market. It was a straight-up ultimatum. Okay, so you've got this two-pronged attack: fighting in Washington and fighting in the courtroom. The big question is, did this wild strategy actually work? Well, the results were, they were nothing short of astonishing. Remember that $145 million loss that almost sank the company? Well, get this. Between 1986 and 1993, TI's patent strategy brought in over $1.5 billion in royalties. That is an absolutely staggering turnaround, and it was fueled almost entirely by their ideas. The impact of this was just profound. This royalty money, it was almost pure profit. In fact, for a few years there, right in the middle of the crisis, the money TI was making from licensing its patents was more than the money it was making from actually selling its own products. Just let that sink in for a second. So this money wasn't just a nice bonus, it was a lifeline. It was this massive infusion of cash that let them survive the storm. It meant they could keep their R&D labs running, keep innovating when they otherwise would have had to shut everything down. Ultimately, this strategy didn't just save the company, it completely redefined its future.
So how does a corporate giant, a true symbol of American innovation, completely reinvent itself?
And look, this wasn't just some minor course correction. No. We are talking about a fundamental ground-up shift from building complex defense systems and drilling for oil to completely dominating the microscopic world of semiconductors. It was a pivot of truly epic proportions.
But to really understand the triumph, you first have to grasp the crisis. See, back in the mid-1980s, Texas Instruments was an icon, for sure. But it was an icon that had seriously lost its way.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? TI had invented the integrated circuit, the silicon transistor. These guys were pioneers, but their own success had led to this massive sprawl. They were doing a little bit of everything, which meant they weren't really excelling at anything anymore.
So what did that look like on the inside? Well, you had a company tangled up in everything from oil exploration to home computers, and it was all trapped inside this rigid, slow-moving bureaucracy. The culture was brutal, a real up or out kind of place. And while they were all busy with their own red tape, their manufacturing quality was just getting completely lapped by competitors in Japan.
But change was coming, and it started, as it so often does, right at the very top. A new leader stepped in with a completely different vision for the company.
So in 1985, the CEO abruptly resigned, and a guy named Jerry Junkins, a TI veteran, stepped in. But Junkins was different. He totally understood the company's DNA, but he also saw that the very culture that had built TI into a powerhouse was now the thing that was threatening to tear it all apart.
And his first move was a complete cultural overhaul. You had the old TI, bureaucratic, totally top-down, with that harsh upper-out culture. Junkins basically dismantled that whole system. He replaced it with an emphasis on teamwork and actually empowering employees. His goal, and he said this himself, was to make TI a human place again.
And to fix that manufacturing crisis, he championed a philosophy called total quality management. See, he knew that just working harder wasn't going to cut it. They had to work smarter. And that meant everyone, from the factory floor all the way to the executive suite, had to become obsessed with quality.
So, did it actually work? Well, a cultural shift is a really hard thing to measure, but Junkins and his team were about to get some massive, undeniable proof that they were on the right track.
In 1992, that proof arrived. TI's defense group won the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. Now, this is not just some industry prize. This is the absolute gold standard for manufacturing and management excellence in the United States. It's awarded by the president. This was it, the undeniable proof that the revolution was working.
Okay, but fixing the culture, that was only half the battle. TI was still this sprawling conglomerate. The next phase of the transformation was going to be even more painful, deciding what Texas Instruments would actually be.
I think this quote just captures the brutal reality of their situation perfectly. To save the company, they had to be willing to sell off huge pieces of their own history, even divisions that were making money, all to focus on what really mattered for the future.
So the leadership team identified two areas where TI was truly world-class. These became their crown jewels. First, digital signal processors, or DSPs. These are hyper-specialized chips for processing signals in real time. And second, maybe even more important, analog chips. These are the critical little translators that take real-world signals like sound and temperature and turn them into the ones and zeros our digital devices can understand.
And choosing these crown jewels meant everything else had to go. And this part was brutal. We're talking about selling Geophysical Service Inc., the original oil exploration business the company was literally founded on. They sold their highly profitable defense division, and they finally exited the commodity DRAM memory chip business, a market that had caused them so much financial pain for years.
And as you can see, this was a deliberate 10-year strategic march. Selling the founding business in '88 was a huge emotional break from the past. Then selling the defense business in '97 and getting out of memory in '98, those were the final decisive steps to becoming a pure-play semiconductor company.
And just to give you a sense of scale here, the sale of the defense business, the makers of the famous HARM missile, to Raytheon, was for nearly $3 billion. This was a massive move that gave them both the capital and the clarity they needed for what was coming next.
So after all that cultural change and all those painful goodbyes, what was left? Well, a completely new company had emerged from the ashes of the old conglomerate.
I mean, just think about the contrast. The old TI was a junkyard of unrelated businesses, oil drilling, missiles, home computers, you name it. The new TI was sleek and absolutely laser-focused on the high-tech components that were about to power the entire digital revolution. By the year 2000, the transformation was complete. The company was lean, incredibly profitable, and had perfectly positioned itself as a leader in the very chips that were becoming the essential building blocks for mobile phones and the internet.
So what's the big lesson here? It's the absolute immense power of strategic discipline. The TI story teaches us that true strategy isn't about what you decide to do, it's about what you have the courage to stop doing. It's about having the conviction to get rid of everything else, no matter how painful it feels.
We live in a world that's just obsessed with moonshots and hype. So how in the world did one tech giant pull off a massive turnaround by, choosing to be boring on purpose? So you see this quote, a formidable counter-narrative. A counter-narrative to what, though? See, this whole story, it's a huge slap in the face to the typical Silicon Valley playbook of just chasing growth at all costs. This is a story of discipline over disruption, and honestly, it's absolutely fascinating. Okay, so to really get this turnaround, you've got to understand the mess they were in first. Back in the late 90s, Texas Instruments wasn't this focused company we know today. Oh no, it was this massive, sprawling, kind of incoherent mess, just teetering on the edge of chaos. And look at this portfolio. I mean, this barely even scratches the surface. They were dabbling in defense electronics, software, all these different kinds of chips, you name it. And all that lack of focus, it made their performance a total roller coaster for investors. Wildly unpredictable. And one of these businesses, man, it was a special kind of nightmare. Which brings us right to their first big, gutsy move, escaping what you'd call the commodity trap. See, TI made this pretty radical call to just get out of the DRAM memory chip business. Now, this stuff was essential to the tech world for sure, but competing in that market, it was an absolute bloodbath.
And this chart just shows you exactly why they had to bail. Just look at this. Between 96 and 98, the price for some of these memory chips just cratered. We're talking a nearly 95% drop. Can you even imagine that? It was just this brutal boom and bust cycle that TI realized, hey, we just can't afford to be a part of this anymore.
So let's put these two business models side by side, because the contrast is pretty stark. On one side, you've got DRAM. Total chaos, brutal cycles, crazy price wars. And then on the other side, you've got the analog business. This is where TI saw its future. Now, these are the chips that do the really cool stuff, like turning real-world signals, sound, temperature, you name it, into digital data. And because they're so specialized, they have these super long life cycles, great margins, and, get this, customers who actually stick around. The choice was a no-brainer, really.
So you're probably asking, okay, how'd they pull it off? Well, this wasn't just some simple sale. No, this was a masterpiece of financial engineering. They basically handed off the assets to Micron, even gave them some financing to help, and in return, they got notes and equity. So they got out of a terrible business, limited their risk, and still kept some skin in the game for future upside. Just brilliant. Okay, so they escaped that commodity trap. But then, TI had to face a whole other temptation, the sexy trap. This was right at the dawn of the smartphone age, right? And TI's OMAP processors, they were everywhere. They were dominant. It was the hottest market in tech, but, it was also a total siren song, just luring them towards disaster. So here was the problem. Their profits were getting absolutely squeezed from 3 different directions at once. First up, their biggest customers, think Apple, started saying, hey, we can just make our own chips. Then, their competitors, like Qualcomm, started bundling their modems and processors together, creating this package that was basically unbeatable. And finally, you had this insane R&D arms race. The need for faster, smaller chips just demanded these massive, unsustainable investments. It was a race to the bottom. So what did TI do? Did they double down? Nope. They took that amazing OMAP technology and did another brilliant pivot. Instead of chasing that fickle consumer market with its super short life cycles and shrinking margins, they aimed it right at the automotive and industrial sectors. See, in that world, reliability is way more important than raw speed. And product life cycles, they're measured in decades, not months. Game changer.
All right, so we've talked a lot about what TI stopped doing. So now let's get into what they started doing. They went all in on building this impenetrable fortress in the analog chip market. And the cornerstone of that whole fortress was one absolute masterstroke of an acquisition. Get this, $6.5 billion. And they paid in cash. This was not some timid little step. This was a massive, all-in bet that the entire future of Texas Instruments was analog chips. This one move just screams conviction, right? And boom, here's the immediate result. Now, before the deal, TI was already the leader, but it was in a really fragmented market. They had about 14%. But after snapping up National Semiconductor, they instantly consolidated their power. They created this huge gap between them and everyone else that was going to be almost impossible for the competition to close.
And the strategic thinking behind this? Just flawless. They suddenly had thousands of new products, creating a portfolio so huge, it basically became a one-stop shop for any engineer. Then they plugged all those new products into their own sales force, which was 10 times bigger, and started making everything in their own super efficient factories. I mean, that's just a recipe for total dominance. But what's really crucial to understand here is that these moves weren't just random shots in the dark. No, they were all part of this deep, coherent philosophy. And it was driven by 2 key leaders who, over decades, just methodically reshaped the company's entire DNA. First, you've got Tom Engibus, who I'd call the architect. He was the one who made those incredibly tough calls to just dismantle the old, bloated, unfocused company. And then you get Rich Templeton, the executor. He took that clean, focused vision from Engibus and just relentlessly optimized it for one single thing: generating free cash flow. We're talking about the actual cash a company has left after paying for everything. He made that the North Star for TI, the ultimate measure of success. And all of that, it comes together in what people now call the TI way. It's a whole philosophy that pretty much completely rejects that moonshot culture you see everywhere else in Silicon Valley. It's not about chasing the next shiny object. It's about disciplined, steady, incremental improvement and just generating cash. That's it. It's about the long, slow, profitable grind.
All right, we're gonna look at how they built a financial powerhouse by basically tearing up the entire Silicon Valley rulebook.
So, to really get how TI operates, you have to understand their prime directive. It's not about being the biggest or the fastest or even the most innovative. Nope, it's about one thing and one thing only.
And that one thing is free cash flow per share. Now, for most tech companies, this is just some boring line item on a quarterly report. For TI, it's everything. It is the North Star that guides every single decision they make.
And believe me, they are not shy about it. They've been shouting this from the rooftops for over 20 years. While other tech giants were out there chasing headlines and fighting for market share, TI was just quietly, relentlessly focused on this one single goal, making as much cash as humanly possible for its owners.
Okay, so how does a relentless focus on cash actually change the kind of products you decide to build? This is where the strategy gets really, really clever.
This right here, this is the absolute core of their product strategy. Instead of chasing the latest, flashiest digital trends, TI focuses on analog chips. These are the workhorses that translate real-world signals, like sound and temperature, into data. So while a high-end graphics card is basically a paperweight in 18 months, an analog chip, it's based on the laws of physics. It can have a useful life of 10, maybe even 20 years.
And to make this forever product model work, they completely avoid relying on any single customer. I mean, look at this. They have over 100,000 different clients. This means they're not tied to the crazy boom and bust cycle of consumer electronics. If the latest smartphone is a total flop, for TI, it's just a tiny little blip on their radar.
So when you put all of this together, what do you get? You get a remarkably stable business. We're talking high margins, R&D costs that are spread out over decades, and super loyal industrial customers who aren't going to switch suppliers just to save a few pennies. It's a predictable, powerful, cash-generating machine.
So this machine, it prints an incredible amount of cash. So what do they do with all that money? This, my friends, is where TI's discipline becomes truly impressive. Their formula is brutally simple. Step 1, reinvest whatever's needed to maintain their competitive edge. And step 2, every single dollar left over goes right back to the shareholders through dividends and stock buybacks. No exceptions, no excuses, no fancy projects.
This number is just staggering. Between 2004 and 2024, TI reduced its number of outstanding shares by almost half. Think about that. If you were a long-term shareholder, you now own almost double the percentage of the company without buying a single additional share. They are literally concentrating the ownership for their most loyal investors.
And here's another incredible number. For 22 consecutive years, from 2004 all the way to 2024, Texas Instruments has increased its dividend payout. This kind of consistency is almost unheard of in the tech world. It puts them in a truly elite class of companies.
But you know, this commitment to dividends does more than just reward shareholders. It acts as a set of golden handcuffs on management. Because that cash already has a designated home, there's way less temptation to squander it on risky, ego-driven acquisitions or some pet project with low returns. It enforces a powerful fiscal discipline from the inside out.
All right, now we get to my favorite part of the story. The most misunderstood, and you could argue, the most powerful part of TI's whole strategy. It's a move that looks completely insane to the rest of the semiconductor industry.
See, for just about any other chip maker, a warehouse full of unsold chips is an absolute nightmare. Technology moves so fast that inventory can become obsolete and totally worthless almost overnight. It's seen as a major risk, a huge drain on capital.
But this is where TI completely flips the script. They don't just tolerate inventory, they embrace it. They have turned what everyone else sees as a huge liability into one of their greatest strategic assets. And the way they pull this off, it's just brilliant. They use something called a die bank. So instead of making a finished chip and sticking it on a shelf, they complete about 90% of the manufacturing process, creating these huge silicon wafers. Then they store these semi-finished wafers, or dies, sometimes for years. This whole process gives them incredible flexibility. So they've got this bank of generic, semi-finished wafers just sitting there, ready to go. Then, when a customer places an order, they just pull a wafer from the bank and do the final packaging step to create the exact chip that's needed. It lets them respond to demand with amazing speed. And here is the secret sauce, the reason this works for TI and pretty much nobody else. Remember those forever products? Because their analog chips don't really become obsolete. A wafer that's been sitting in that die bank for 2 years is just as valuable and functional as one that was made yesterday. The risk is practically zero. And just look at their commitment to this. TI intentionally holds over 200 days of inventory, way more than its rivals. So when the global supply chain completely seized up a while back, their competitors were stuck. But TI, they had the parts ready to go. They didn't just survive that crisis, they gained market share and became heroes to their customers, all because they could deliver when nobody else could.
You know, in the high-stakes world of semiconductors, pretty much everyone follows the same playbook. But there's this one giant, Texas Instruments, that's playing a completely different game. While everybody else zigs, they zag. And it all boils down to this contrarian strategy that gives them a massive kind of hidden advantage.
So that's the big question, right? How do you win? You could pour all your money into designing the fastest, most powerful chip, or you could play an entirely different game. Well, Texas Instruments, or TI as we'll call them, they chose that second path. They decided to focus not on what they make, but on how they make it.
So most of the big names you know, think NVIDIA, Qualcomm, they use what's called the fabless model. They design these incredible chips, but they pay someone else, like a foundry like TSMC, to actually make them. TI's model? It's the complete opposite. It's all about vertical integration. They believe that owning their own factories, their fabs, is the key. It gives them this killer combo of lower costs and total control over their supply. And the cornerstone of that whole strategy is a deceptively simple choice they made about the silicon wafer. You know, the round disk that every chip is built on. This is where TI's genius really starts to shine. See, most of TI's competitors who make similar kinds of chips, they use the industry standard 200mm or 8-inch wafer. But years ago, TI made this massive bet on the much larger 300mm or 12-inch wafer for their analog chips. They were pioneers with this, and they are still leading the charge today. The difference in scale here is it's wild. A 300mm wafer has 2.25 times the surface area of a 200mm one. But, and this is the kicker, the cost to process the entire wafer, you know, all the chemicals, the gases, the machine time, it's roughly the same for both sizes. So you're getting more than double the real estate for your chips for the same basic processing cost. And the payoff? It's huge. By making their chips on these bigger wafers, TI gets way more chips out of every single batch. And the result of that? They slash the cost of each individual chip by about 40% compared to their competitors on the smaller wafers. I mean, that is a massive sustainable cost advantage. Okay, so you're probably thinking the logical next question, right? If the economics are that good, why isn't the entire industry just using 300mm wafers for everything? Well, there's a catch. And that catch has everything to do with the type of chips that TI makes. For a long time, these giant 300mm fabs were really only used for the super expensive, complex digital chips, like CPUs and GPUs. And that's because to make the math work, you need an absolutely massive volume of chips to fill up that huge wafer. Well, TI's bread and butter is analog chips. These are the small, inexpensive workhorse chips that go into pretty much every electronic device you can imagine. To fill a giant fab with these little things, you need to be making billions and billions of them. So how in the world does TI get that kind of volume? Well, they have a product catalog of over 80,000 different chips. They are one of the very, very few analog companies on the entire planet with the sheer scale and market share to actually make the 300mm economics work. They can keep those giant wafers full day in and day out. Okay, so they've got the volume. But building these fabs costs billions of dollars. So the next part of this story is just as clever. It's how TI built this whole empire on the cheap. They were so smart about this. TI really got this strategy going back in 2009 when they opened their first big 300mm analog fab using widely available used equipment. Then in 2021, they pulled off this incredible deal, buying an entire, fully built fab from Micron for just $900 million, which is just a fraction of what it would cost to build a new one from scratch. So they were buying up all this equipment from memory companies that were getting out of the business or from logic companies that were upgrading their own gear. The key point is they were acquiring it all, as the saying goes, for pennies on the dollar. So they built a leading-edge cost structure on a foundation of trailing-edge capital costs. I mean, that is just brilliant.
So they've proven the model works, it's a huge success, but are they resting on their laurels? No way. They see this massive wave of demand coming for chips, and they are now doubling down with an aggressive plan to expand their manufacturing fortress.
So what's driving all this? Well, the world just wants more and more chips. We're seeing this huge structural increase in demand, and it's being pushed by massive trends like the electrification of cars, which use a ton of these analog chips, and the rapid rise of industrial automation and all those factory robots.
So how serious is TI about meeting this new demand? Get ready for this number. They've laid out a plan to invest $5 billion a year in capital expenditures through 2026. That is a massive commitment to their in-house manufacturing strategy. And that money is going into some absolutely gigantic projects. They're building a potential 4-fab mega campus in Sherman, Texas. It's one of the largest economic projects in the history of the state. And they're already building a second fab right next to that one they bought from Micron out in Utah. All right, let's pull all this together. We've got lower cost from the big wafers, they built their fabs for cheap, they're investing billions more to expand. So what's the ultimate payoff? What does this all add up to? Well, it really comes down to one simple, powerful word: control. Just to put this into perspective for you, back in 2020, about 80% of TI's chips were made in their own factories. By 2030, their goal is to push that number to an incredible 95%. That basically means becoming almost completely self-sufficient, only relying on outside foundries for the most niche, tiny product lines. And the advantages of that control are huge. First, it insulates them from foundries like TSMC, who have been raising prices. They don't have to worry about that. Second, it gives them direct control over their own supply chain destiny. And let me tell you, this became a critical selling point for their customers, especially in the auto industry, who got absolutely burned by the global chip shortage back in 2021. TI can promise a certainty of supply that fabless companies just can't.
Okay, picture this. A massive, multi-billion-dollar company decides seemingly out of the blue to fire its biggest sales partners. It sounds completely nuts, right? Well, that is exactly what the semiconductor giant Texas Instruments did. And in the process, they pretty much rewrote the playbook for their entire industry.
And that's really the big question here, isn't it? For decades, the system they had in place worked just fine. It was a well-oiled machine. So why on earth would you blow it up? Well, let's get into it and unpack one of the biggest and, weirdly, one of the quietest supply chain revolutions we've seen in a long time.
So to really get why this was such a big deal, we've got to go back and look at how things used to be. You see, for a company like Texas Instruments, making the chips was really only half the battle. The other, arguably harder half, was actually getting those chips into the hands of tens of thousands of different customers all around the globe.
For a long, long time, the whole industry ran on these middlemen, these huge distributor companies like Avnet and Arrow Electronics. And these guys were absolutely crucial. They held all the inventory, they handled the ridiculously complex logistics, and they took care of sales for all the smaller customers that TI just couldn't deal with directly. And you gotta remember, for decades, this wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. These middlemen existed for a reason. They solved a giant logistics problem. But then, things started to change. Around 2019, Texas Instruments started making some moves. And it wasn't just some minor adjustment. It was the beginning of what you could only call a quiet revolution, a very deliberate plan to tear down the very system they'd relied on for years.
And what's just crazy when you look at this is the speed of it all. I mean, for decades it was one way. Then boom, in 2019 TI starts this process, and by the end of that same year, they tell one of their biggest partners, Avnet, that the party's over. Just like that. A really fast and decisive break with the past.
And look, this was not a small deal. It literally sent shockwaves through the entire industry. You better believe everyone, competitors, customers, investors, was watching and wondering, what is TI doing? It was a massive, massive gamble. I mean, the sheer audacity of it. They weren't just tweaking a strategy. They were betting the farm on being able to reinvent a system that had worked forever.
Which, of course, brings us right back to that big question. Why? Why would you do this? What was the strategic playbook behind this huge shift to go it alone?
Okay, so this lays out the trade-off perfectly. With the old distributor model, you've got a bunch of problems. You can't really see where all your stuff is, the sales data you get is all lumped together and messy, and, this is a big one, you're giving away a slice of the pie. But on the other hand, going direct, well, suddenly you've got total control of your inventory, you get this incredibly detailed customer data, and you get to keep all the profit. A much better deal, right?
So really, it all boiled down to three key things they were after. First, and this is the most obvious one, capture the margin, right? Stop paying the middleman and keep that profit for yourself. Second, get a handle on your inventory. You don't want a part that's needed in Germany just sitting uselessly in a warehouse in Hong Kong. And third, and this might be the most important one of all, collect data. This, right here, this was the real gold mine. Think about it. Instead of getting a big, messy summary from a distributor, TI could now see everything. They could see exactly who was buying, what they were buying, when they were buying it, even what project they were using it for. That kind of super detailed real-time data, it's an absolute game changer for figuring out what you need to build next. Okay, but you can't just flip a switch on a change this big. You have to build the whole engine to make it run. And TI did. They poured a ton of investment into their website, turning TI.com into this incredible one-stop shop where engineers could find data sheets, use design tools, and then go right from ordering 1 or 2 parts for a prototype to ordering thousands for a full production run. It's a huge lesson. Going direct means you have to build the tools to become the new middleman.
All right, so they made the huge bet, they built a new engine, but did it actually pay off? Let's take a look at the results of this whole revolution.
Get ready for this number, because it is just staggering. By 2024, 80% of Texas Instruments revenue was being processed directly through their own channels. This wasn't some little side project. This became the absolute core of their entire business.
And this chart just puts it all in perspective. I mean, just look at that jump. In 2019, direct sales were about a third of their business. Just 5 years later, it's 80%. That kind of massive, rapid transformation is, well, it's almost unheard of for a company this big.
Now, it wasn't a perfectly smooth ride, of course not. There were some bumps in the road, some friction with customers who were really used to doing things the old way. But the long-term outcome, absolutely undeniable. They got structural, long-term improvements to their profit margins and a way closer relationship with their customers. It's that classic idea, right? A little bit of short-term pain for a whole lot of long-term gain.
And that really gets to the heart of it all, the ultimate payoff. This was never just about saving a few bucks on margins or streamlining logistics. At its core, this entire strategy was about owning the single most valuable asset in modern business, the customer relationship.
What TI managed to create is what you'd call a stickier ecosystem. By building all those design tools directly into their e-commerce platform, they tied the engineer's entire workflow directly to them. So from that first little spark of an idea all the way to the final massive purchase, TI is the partner at every single step. And that is an incredibly powerful competitive advantage.
So here's a question for you. How does a company become the face of America First manufacturing while at the same time relying on China for almost a fifth of its revenue? It sounds impossible, right? Well, let's dive into the absolute masterclass in geopolitical strategy from Texas Instruments.
And this really lays out the central paradox perfectly. On one hand, you have TI, this champion of bringing manufacturing back to the US. But on the other, boom, nearly a fifth of their money comes directly from China. It's a fascinating, high-stakes tightrope walk, and we're going to break down exactly how they pull it off. Okay, so first things first. To really get this, we've got to pop the hood and look at the engine room to see why China is so incredibly important to TI's entire operation. Just look at this. We're talking about almost 20% of their total revenue coming straight from the Chinese market. Now, that's actually down a bit from 24% back in 2022, but it's still the critical cash flow that's funding their massive expansion in the US. I mean, think about that for a second. They are literally using Chinese money to build factories designed to insulate the West from China. It's kind of wild. So this brings up the elephant in the room, right? What happens if Beijing gets fed up with US tech restrictions and just says, you know what, we're banning TI chips? Could that just turn off the money spigot that's funding this whole American dream? Well, this is where TI has a pretty powerful shield. See, they are the absolute kings of analog chips. Now, these aren't the flashy, super fast digital chips you always hear about. These are the workhorses, the foundational bits and pieces that are way harder to just swap out. And while Chinese companies are trying to catch up, they just don't have the same reputation for reliability and quality, especially for the really critical stuff.
Okay, so they've got their defenses up against retaliation in China. But that's only half the story. The other, and maybe even more important half, is how they're playing the game in Washington, D.C. And man, this is where things get really sophisticated.
So picture this.
As the US government started getting really worried about semiconductor supply chains, TI made a brilliant move. While everyone else was focused on the cutting-edge chips from companies like Intel, TI stepped up and said, hey, wait a minute, those foundational, mature node chips we make, yeah, those are just as vital for national security.
And they didn't just make an argument. They practically helped write the rulebook. This was their playbook for the CHIPS Act. Step 1, convince everyone that their boring analog chips were essential. Step 2, make sure the government money didn't only go to the sexy next-gen stuff. And Step 3, the real masterstroke, push to cut all the red tape so they could build their new factories faster.
And this quote just captures their genius perfectly. It wasn't just about getting a handout. They understood that time is money, and getting a clear runway to build, without years of delays, was arguably even more valuable than the cash itself.
All right, so TI has the cash from China, and they have the backing from Washington. Now, how do you package all that up and sell it to your customers? Well, their pitch is simple, and it's brilliant. They're selling supply chain insurance.
This is their key marketing phrase. It sounds a little corporate, sure, but what it's really saying is, hey, the world is an unpredictable mess, but you can count on us. It's a direct shot at all their competitors who are still totally reliant on factories in places like Taiwan or mainland China, which every CEO now sees as a huge risk. And why is that pitch so powerful? Well, it all starts right here, with a single tiny component that might only cost $1. Because, as we all learned the hard way back in 2021, a single missing $1 chip can bring an entire $50,000 car production line to a dead stop. For a giant automaker, that's not just an inconvenience, that's a full-blown nightmare.
So you see, Texas Instruments isn't just selling a piece of silicon anymore. By building these gigantic new fabs in Texas and Utah, what they're really selling is peace of mind. They're selling the world's biggest companies insurance against that exact nightmare scenario.
So, after all that complex maneuvering on multiple fronts, did it actually work? Did the strategy pay off? Let's take a look at the results. Oh yeah, it worked. Big time. In August of 2024, TI got the call from the US Department of Commerce. The prize? Up to $1.6 billion in direct funding from the CHIPS Act. That's a huge win, plain and simple.
But hold on, because as massive as that number is, it wasn't even the biggest prize on the table. The real game changer was something called the Investment Tax Credit, or ITC for short.
And this chart really puts their victory into perspective. That cool $1.6 billion in direct cash, it's practically dwarfed by the estimated $6 to $8 billion they're going to get from that tax credit. It's essentially a massive 25% discount on all their new factory equipment, which radically improves the profitability of building in America.
And really, this one idea, this quote right here, is the key to unlocking their whole story. It explains how Texas Instruments completely reinvented itself, choosing discipline over disruption and stability over speed. All right, so let's get right into it. How in the world does a company that you might know from, calculators transform itself into this absolute cash flow machine by embracing the idea of being boring? Well, it all started back in the 2000s. TI made this monumental decision. They looked at the wild, high-risk world of consumer tech. We're talking memory chips, mobile processors, and they basically said, you know what? We're getting off this roller coaster. They wanted to build something that would last. So what was their new focus? Analog chips. Now, these are not the flashy, super fast processors you find in your smartphone. Nope. These are the essential workhorse chips that translate real-world things like temperature, sound, and pressure into digital data. They're the bedrock of everything electronic. TI decided they were going to dominate a market that's governed by physics, not fads. And this is where it gets really interesting, because that one pivot shaped their entire business. It allowed them to build this quiet empire, a kind of monopoly that doesn't even need the label, just quietly powering a modern world. Their whole strategy, it really boils down to these core pillars. They have a laser focus on analog and embedded chips. They're absolutely relentless and disciplined about how they spend money to grow. And they made a huge long-term bet on making their own chips right here in the US. All of that feeds into this massive cash flow engine. And that bet on US manufacturing? Incredibly smart. By building their own advanced fabrication plants, their fabs, on American soil, they're basically insulating themselves from all the global supply chain chaos for decades. It's just a brilliant hedge against all the uncertainty in the world.
But look, a business model this solid doesn't just run itself. The hardware is only half the story. To keep this thing going for decades, you need a very specific kind of corporate culture, and that is the real defensive moat around their business. And let me tell you, it is the polar opposite of Silicon Valley. Yeah, this slide just lays it out perfectly. While Silicon Valley is all about move fast and break things, TI has built a fortress around stability, slow and steady progress, and absolute uncompromising reliability. They grow their own leaders from within instead of constantly hiring flashy rock stars from the outside. And this commitment to keeping things steady, it's honestly staggering. Think about this. Their former CEO spent his entire career at the company. His successor, a 26-year veteran. Leadership changes are planned out years, sometimes even decades ahead of time so that the long-term vision never, ever gets shaky. So if you've got all this incredible talent, how do you keep them? Well, they built a system designed specifically to protect and reward their most valuable asset, their brilliant engineers, by valuing deep technical skill above all else. They call it the technical ladder. And what it does is it lets brilliant engineers just keep on engineering. They can climb all the way to the highest levels of the company, earning the same kind of money and respect as a vice president without ever having to become a people manager. This is absolutely crucial for keeping that world-class talent in-house. So why go to all this trouble? Well, because analog design isn't like writing code that you can just automate. It's often called a black art, a craft that really takes years of apprenticeship and intuition to get right. So losing a senior analog designer, that's like a great library losing its most precious, one-of-a-kind books. You just can't replace that. And this, right here, this is maybe the most important part of the whole story. It's this cultural shift from a consumer mindset to an industrial one. TI literally had to retrain its workforce. See, for a smartphone chip, being good enough to last 3 years is fine. But for a chip inside a car's braking system or a factory robot, failure is simply not an option. And that number right there, 15 plus years, that's why it's so hard for competitors to challenge them. We're talking about 15 years of perfect performance in really harsh places, intense heat, constant vibrations, power surges. That unbelievably high standard for reliability, that's TI's unbreakable shield. Now, this kind of long-term, stable culture has its own internal dynamics too. You can see that while TI is facing the same challenges as the rest of the engineering world, the company is really focused on building its talent pipeline to make sure it can sustain itself for the next generation. And that same focus on building a stable future, well, it goes all the way to the top. The company's leadership shows a real commitment to evolving for the long haul, making sure that the vision is guided by a whole range of diverse perspectives. All right, so let's put it all together. What happens when you combine this incredibly smart business model with this deeply ingrained culture of reliability? Well, you get a market position that is almost impossible to attack. The company's discipline, their relentless focus on their industrial customers, it's created this compounding advantage over time. It's just gotten harder and harder for anyone else to even try to compete. And history has shown us, time and again, that betting against TI's long game is pretty much always a losing bet. So, what's the big takeaway here? I think it's that Texas Instruments proves something pretty profound. That sometimes the smartest move you can make is to just ignore all the hype, play the long game, and build a quiet, unshakable, and wildly profitable foundation. Which kind of leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on. In a world that is obsessed with speed, could the ultimate competitive advantage just be patience?